Amara Cole froze. Her reflection trembled in the curve of her champagne glass, fractured by crystal and light. Across the ballroom of the Hyatt Regency in downtown Atlanta, beneath a chandelier that glittered like falling stars, her husband's hand rested on another woman's back. Low, familiar, intimate. And the girl laughed. That careless, golden laugh that didn't yet know shame or consequence. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. The music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, all of it fell away. There was only Amara, her heartbeat, and the shimmer of betrayal under the soft jazz lighting. If this story already has your pulse tightening, don't look away. Stay until the last word, and if you feel something, let it out. Like, comment, follow, not for me, but for every woman who's ever had to stand still while her world cracked open. The sound returned in fragments. Laughter, a waiter's voice, the soft hum of luxury. But the image stayed. Ethan Walker, her husband of 7 years, leaned in to whisper something into his assistant's ear. Lila, 25, blonde, impossibly young. The same woman Amara had promoted just last year, believing she was helping another woman rise. Now that same woman was holding the attention of her husband, the man who had once promised Amara the world. No one else seemed to notice, but in circles like theirs, the elite of Atlanta's tech and venture capital scene, silence was never ignorance. It was entertainment. The shark smelled blood before it spilled. Amara smiled, even as her fingers tightened around her glass. The world knew her as composed, brilliant, unshakable. A Forbes cover feature had once called her the queen of calm in a storm. She would not let the storm see her break. Ethan turned, catching her gaze. For one devastating second, their eyes met, and in that second she saw everything. Not guilt, not even fear, just indifference. He'd already left her. He just hadn't bothered to tell her yet. Her throat burned, but her voice, when she finally spoke to the woman beside her, was smooth as silk. "Excuse me," she said, setting her drink down, the stem of the glass tapping the marble table like a gavel. "I think I just remembered something I need to take care of." Outside the ballroom, the air was cooler, the city's hum waiting like a living thing. Atlanta glittered through the glass windows, skyscrapers and headlights and dreams stacked high enough to touch the sky. She pressed her palm against the cold surface and breathed. Once, twice. She had fought her entire life to be here, to be seen. A black girl from Detroit who'd clawed her way into the white, moneyed heart of the South's new tech empire. She had believed that love would make the climb less lonely. Instead, it had made the fall more brutal. Her phone buzzed. A message from Ethan. "You okay?" "Perfectly." Her thumb hovered over the screen before locking the phone. She wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Not tonight. Not ever again. Back inside, applause echoed as Ethan took the stage. His voice filled the ballroom. That easy, confident tone that had once made her fall in love. "Tonight we celebrate innovation," he said, smiling that politician's smile. "And the people who make Atlanta the future of tech." The crowd cheered. Lila sat near the front, glowing in borrowed light. Amara watched from the doorway. For years she had stood by his side on stages like this, smiling, applauding, believing they were partners building something together. But standing in the shadows now, she understood. She'd been the foundation, not the equal. The woman who did the work while he took the spotlight. The crystal chandeliers caught her reflection again. Fractured, refracted, reborn. She turned away from the stage and whispered to herself, "No, Ethan. This isn't my ending. It's yours." Outside, a soft rain began to fall over Peachtree Street. Amara stepped into it without an umbrella, the silk of her dress clinging to her skin, her heels sinking slightly into the wet pavement. She didn't care. The rain felt honest. It didn't pretend to shine. Each drop seemed to wash away another layer of illusion. The picture-perfect marriage, the matching luxury cars, the magazine spreads. Underneath it all, she was still Amara, the girl who had built herself from nothing, who had turned every no into a door kicked open. And now, she would rebuild again. Not for him, not to prove anything, but because that's what survivors do. They rise. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a different message. A friend sending her a photo from the gala. Ethan, mid-speech, holding a glass high. Lila in the frame beside him, her smile too wide, her hand too close. Amara stared at it for a moment, then pressed delete. She didn't need the evidence tonight, only the memory. The truth was enough fuel. She lifted her chin, the city lights painting her skin in gold and glass. "You think you've humiliated me," she murmured, her voice steady, low, dangerous. "But you've just handed me my freedom." The rain fell harder, blurring the skyline, turning every light into a soft flame. Somewhere inside the hotel, applause broke out again. A standing ovation for a man who just set fire to his own empire. Amara smiled, slow and sharp. She would let him have his spotlight for now, because when the truth finally shattered, the sound would echo louder than any applause. And she would be the one left standing when the glass hit the floor. Before the glass shattered in Atlanta, before her name appeared in glossy magazines and glowing headlines, Amara Cole had already learned what it meant to fight for air in a room that didn't want her breathing. She was born in Detroit, in a neighborhood where sirens were lullabies and ambition was a fragile thing, a spark easily crushed by the weight of survival. Her mother, Denise, worked double shifts at a nursing home. Her father, who had once played trumpet in smoky downtown jazz bars, left when she was 10. The day he walked out, he left behind two things: an old trumpet case and a lesson Amara would never forget, that dreams were nothing without discipline. Amara grew up in the hum of machinery and the rhythm of resilience. She didn't fit neatly anywhere, too ambitious for the block, too poor for the prep academies that whispered promises of better futures. But she had that thing no one could teach: hunger. The kind that makes your hands shake when you talk about what you want. The kind that makes you do more than everyone else because you know you can't afford not to. At 16, she got her first laptop, a secondhand Dell she bought with saved tips from a diner job. She used it not for games or gossip, but to teach herself code from free online tutorials. In that humming blue light, she found her freedom. Algorithms didn't care about skin color, neighborhood, or last name. Logic was fair. It rewarded whoever refused to quit. Her high school counselor once told her, "People like you don't end up in Silicon Valley, Amara." She'd smiled, not because it didn't hurt, but because she'd already learned that disbelief was another form of motivation. By 20, she was a scholarship student at Georgia Tech, one of the few black women in her computer engineering program. The first week, a professor mispronounced her name 3 times in front of the class. When she corrected him, he raised an eyebrow and said, "You'll have to speak up if you want to be heard in this field." So she did. Every chance she got. She built her first app in her dorm room, a digital mentoring platform connecting underrepresented students with tech professionals. It won a Campus Innovation Award. A venture capitalist visiting from New York called it cute. She called it scalable. By the time she graduated, she had investors. By 26, she had a startup. And by 28, she had her first major acquisition offer from Ethan Walker. He had walked into that first pitch meeting like a man who had never been told no. A silk suit, that easy charm, the faint scent of cedar and confidence. He asked thoughtful questions, listened closely, and, unlike most, didn't talk over her. When the deal closed, he congratulated her not with condescension, but admiration. Or at least that's what it looked like then. Ethan wasn't just wealthy. He was pedigree made flesh. Yale, family estate in Charleston, a Rolodex filled with legacy money and political favors. To Amara, who had spent her life building every step from dust, he represented the doors that had always been closed to her. Their partnership turned into late-night strategy sessions, shared victories, and slow, inevitable chemistry. He called her the future. She called him steady ground. When he proposed 2 years later, under the magnolia trees of Piedmont Park, Amara thought she'd finally reached peace. She wasn't naive. She knew what the world saw when it looked at them. A white financier and his brilliant black wife, the perfect photo op for a city obsessed with optics. But she also believed in the story they told themselves, that they were rewriting what power looked like. Marriage didn't soften Amara. It sharpened her. She built her company, ArcLight Technologies, into one of Atlanta's most influential startups. She hired diversely, paid fairly, and refused to let anyone call her success a movement. It was business, It was excellence. It was earned. Still, cracks began to whisper beneath the perfection. At industry galas, she noticed how people addressed Ethan first, even when her name was on the plaque. She noticed how he began speaking for her during panels, how his jokes about her fiery drive landed with audiences who thought they were compliments. Once, after an argument about a deal she refused to sign, he'd sighed and said, "You're impossible when you think you're right." She had smiled then, calm and deadly. That's the only time worth being impossible. But over time, the balance shifted. His confidence became dominance. Her achievements became trophies in his narrative. And still, Amara stayed composed. She told herself that love was about patience, that partnerships evolved, that compromise wasn't surrender. Then came the headlines. Ethan Walker's firm secures record-breaking Series B funding. Articles written about her work carried his quotes. Their marriage, once a merger of equals, had turned into a brand campaign for him. She should have seen it then, the slow erasure of her name. But success can be its own kind of narcotic. It dulls the instinct to question what you've built and who it's for. Amara's mother visited once, after seeing them in a magazine spread titled, "The New Face of Southern Power." She looked at the photos, Amara poised, Ethan smiling beside her, and said quietly, "You look beautiful, baby," but not happy. Amara had laughed it off, the way people laugh when they're afraid the truth might echo. Years later, standing in that Atlanta ballroom, watching Ethan's hand on another woman's back, she would remember that moment, her mother's voice, the warning hidden in softness. Because long before betrayal, there's always the forgetting, the slow loss of yourself inside someone else's story. And Amara Cole was done being a chapter in a man's book. She was ready to write her own. Their wedding was the kind of event that made headlines, a union not just of two people, but of two empires. It took place beneath the live oaks of a Charleston estate that had been in Ethan Walker's family for generations. The house was all white columns and ghosts of old money, the air heavy with magnolia and history. Guests whispered that the marriage was modern royalty, the brilliant black tech founder from Detroit and the Southern financier whose name carried weight on every boardroom door. Amara remembered the moment before the ceremony, standing alone in her suite, gazing into the mirror. Her reflection looked regal, ivory silk hugging her curves, her natural curls shaped into a crown. But her eyes carried something else, something the camera would never catch, a quiet question. She loved Ethan, yes, but she also knew she was crossing into a world that hadn't been built for women like her. And love, she'd learned, wasn't always enough to keep a door open. Sometimes you had to hold it open yourself. Ethan met her at the altar with that easy smile, the kind that could sell anything to anyone. When he slid the ring onto her finger, she felt the audience lean in, cameras flashing, whispers of perfect couple, power duo, the American dream. For a moment, she believed it, believed that this was balance, that they were equals, two forces destined to build something extraordinary together. Their marriage became a brand, the Walkers, a name that graced magazine covers and conference stages. Together, they hosted charity galas in Atlanta, sat front row at venture summits in New York, toasted to progress and possibility. He wore his suits like armor. She wore her brilliance like light. To the world, they were unstoppable. Behind the scenes, the rhythm of their life was a choreography of ambition. Ethan's firm handled high-profile clients, old money, legacy wealth, family offices with names carved into buildings. Amara's company, ArcLight Technologies, was scaling fast, disrupting the startup world with AI systems that optimize supply chains and social programs alike. They worked late, traveled constantly, lived in glass towers with views of skylines that gleamed like promises. When they were together, they spoke in strategy, mergers, markets, expansions. Love became language coded in balance sheets and projections. But in the quiet moments, the ones without champagne or spotlights, the imbalance began to hum. Ethan liked to say they were building an empire. What he meant was his empire, with her as the jewel on top. He never said it aloud, but Amara felt it in the small ways. The meetings he took without her, the introductions he made where she was labeled my wife, instead of my partner. At first, she brushed it off. Marriage was compromise, wasn't it? Two powerful people learning to share space. But space, she would soon learn, could shrink around one person until the other could barely breathe. There was a dinner once, a fundraiser for an education initiative they co-chaired. The governor was there, along with CEOs and senators. Amara had designed the campaign strategy herself. Yet when the governor praised Ethan Walker's vision, her husband didn't correct him. He only smiled, lifted his glass, and let the applause roll over him like warm rain. Later that night, when she asked why he hadn't spoken up, Ethan had laughed softly. "Does it really matter who gets the credit, sweetheart? We're a team." It mattered, but she didn't say it then. She simply turned away and studied her reflection in the window, her face caught between the glittering city lights and the dark night beyond. Over time, the little things stacked like glass shards underfoot. His jokes about her fire, the patronizing pat on her shoulder in meetings, the way he used her success to prove his own progressiveness to clients. She became both asset and ornament, the proof of his modernity. When they attended events together, Amara could feel the curiosity in the air. Some women looked at her with admiration, others with calculation. Men looked at her the way they looked at luxury cars, appreciating the craftsmanship, questioning the price. One evening, after a particularly grueling gala in New York, Ethan poured them both a drink. "You handled those investors beautifully," he said, handing her a glass. "You make me look good." Amara smiled, but the words burned. "You make me look good." Not, "We look good together." Not, "You were brilliant." Just utility disguised as flattery. Later, lying beside him in the penthouse suite, she watched him sleep. His hand rested over her waist, possessive even in dreams. And she wondered, not for the first time, whether love could survive ownership. She missed the woman she'd been before the marriage, the one who had coded through the night, who'd built her world from nothing but grit and imagination. Somewhere between the business deals and the dinner parties, she'd become someone polished, perfect, and just a little bit silent. Still, there were moments that fooled her. Ethan surprising her with weekend trips, laughing over takeout in sweatpants, holding her hand in crowded rooms. For a few breaths, it felt like the world they'd promised each other. But love wrapped in luxury can hide 1,000 fractures. The first real argument came over a deal. Ethan wanted her to merge ArcLight with one of his firm's clients, a massive conglomerate that would give them global reach but cost her control. "You'll still be CEO," he'd said. "It's a smart move." "It's your move," she replied. "Not mine." His smile hardened. "You're being emotional." She stared at him for a long moment. "No, Ethan. I'm being strategic. The difference is, I'm not strategizing for you." It was the first time he didn't have a response. After that, a quiet distance settled between them. Not cold, but calculated. He spent more nights at the office. To the world, they were still the Walkers. Flawless, aspirational, a living headline. But inside their glass castle, and deep down, Amara could feel it. The subtle shift of power, the slow unraveling of illusion. Love had once been their empire. It began quietly, not with an argument, not with infidelity, but with silence. Amara noticed first in the smallest things. Last-minute meeting with a potential investor. "I didn't want to bore you with it. Since when do you go to Savannah for business?" He hesitated just long enough for her to notice. "Old client, family money, wants discretion." Something in his tone was too polished, like a man rehearsing truth. That evening, he came home later than planned. She asked how the meeting went. "Good," he said, loosening his tie. "Promising lead." But when he kissed her goodnight, the scent on his shirt wasn't cedar and smoke. It was something floral, something not hers. Amara lay awake long after he fell asleep, staring at the ceiling. Her mind didn't spin with jealousy, but with analysis, the way it did when debugging a code that wouldn't compile. Every inconsistency, every missing variable, every unexplained behavior. In the days that followed, she began to notice more. He started going to the gym earlier, returning home later. His shirts came back from the cleaners with faint traces of perfume she didn't wear. His laughter, once a melody she loved, became a background noise she couldn't trust. And yet, she said nothing. Not because she was afraid, but because silence, she knew, was its own form of reconnaissance. Her assistant, Leah, once mentioned seeing Ethan at a restaurant downtown during lunch hours. He looked like he was meeting someone important, Leah said casually. I didn't want to interrupt. Did you see who? Amara asked. No, just a woman in a cream blazer. Younger, I think. That night, Amara stood in front of her mirror, studying her reflection. Her beauty had always been understated. Elegance without excess, confidence without performance. But she saw the fatigue now, the weight of pretending that everything was still perfect. She ran a hand over her curls, then over the thin gold chain around her neck, a gift from her mother when she'd first moved to Atlanta. Never let them make you small, her mother had said. Not even the ones who say they love you. The next morning, Amara stopped by Ethan's office unannounced. She needed, to see for herself. His assistant looked startled when she arrived. He's in a client meeting, she said. That's fine. I'll wait. An hour passed, then another. When Ethan finally appeared, his tie loosened, his smile too bright. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, surprised that she was there. Amara, you should have told me you were coming. I didn't know I needed an appointment with my husband. He laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. You don't. Just a crazy day. She studied him quietly. Everything all right? Of course. Why? Because you look like a man living a double life, she wanted to say. Because your voice hesitates half a beat too long when you lie. But instead, she smiled. No reason. That night, they attended a charity gala, the kind of event where appearances mattered more than sincerity. They stood side by side for photos, champagne glasses in hand. Ethan told stories, charmed investors, and touched her lower back just enough to look devoted. To anyone watching, they were flawless. But Amara felt the space between his touch and her skin, a space so wide it could hold an entire truth. After the gala, in the car ride home, she turned to him. Ethan, are you happy? He blinked, startled. What kind of question is that? A simple one, he smiled tightly. Of course I'm happy. Why wouldn't I be? Because you've been gone for months, she thought. Because your eyes no longer rest on me the way they used to. Because somewhere between ambition and ego we lost us. But she didn't say it. She just looked out the window as the city lights blurred by, streaks of gold and blue melting into rain. In the weeks that followed, the cracks widened. Ethan began traveling more often. Late-night texts arrived without explanation. Amara's intuition sharpened into certainty, but her proof remained out of reach. Until one evening, when an investor called to thank her for sending Ethan and his assistant to Savannah last weekend. Her pulse slowed. His assistant? Yes, the man laughed. Charming young woman. You've trained your team well. Amara hung up politely, her voice steady. Inside, something cold and clean sliced through her chest. Not grief, but clarity. That night, she waited for him to come home. When he did, smelling faintly of wine and perfume, she asked casually, "How was your trip?" "Productive," he said without missing a beat. She looked at him for a long moment, memorizing the way he lied, the smoothness, the ease, and then she smiled, just enough to unsettle him. "Good," she said softly. "I hope it was worth it." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "Nothing," she replied, turning away. In the reflection of the window, she saw him watching her, uneasy for the first time. The cracks were there now, visible, undeniable. And Amara, who had spent her whole life mastering structure and stability, knew what came next. When glass fractures under pressure, it never warns you twice. It breaks clean, it cuts deep, and it never looks the same again. The night Amara found the truth, the sky above Atlanta was a deep, restless gray, heavy with the kind of silence that feels like a warning. Ethan was working late again. He'd kissed her cheek as he left, the gesture light, rehearsed, automatic. The scent of another woman's perfume still lingered faintly on his collar, sweet and unrecognizable. Amara didn't ask where it came from. She'd stopped asking questions whose answers she already knew. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. The city outside her penthouse windows hummed with faraway laughter and the pulse of nightlife. Inside, the air felt too still, too staged, like a museum of a life she no longer recognized. She poured herself a glass of wine, sat on the edge of their bed, and stared at her reflection in the dark window. There was no anger yet, just an ache so deep it felt quiet. Pain, she had learned, doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it tiptoes in like an old friend. The phone on Ethan's nightstand buzzed. Once, then again. A message preview flashed across the screen. "Lila, I miss you already. Last night was perfect." The glass slipped from her hand and shattered against the floor, red staining the ivory rug like spilled truth. For a long time she didn't move. She simply watched the shards glint in the light. So fragile, so final. Then, with a calmness that scared even her, Amara picked up the phone. She didn't open the message. She didn't need to. She'd seen enough. But curiosity, that cruel, familiar whisper, pushed her further. She opened the phone, scrolled. Messages filled the screen. Weeks of them. "Lila, you make me feel seen. Ethan, you deserve that. Lila, she's so lucky to have you. Ethan, she doesn't see me the way you do." Each word was a blade, not because he'd cheated, but because of what he'd chosen to say. The same language he'd once used to win Amara's heart, repackaged for someone newer, easier, softer. Her chest tightened, breath coming in sharp, controlled gasps. The betrayal wasn't just physical. It was intellectual, emotional. The man she'd built an empire with was recycling their love story like a business model. Scrolling further, she found a series of photos. Ethan and Lila, in Savannah. The restaurant Amara had asked about. The hotel suite she had once chosen for their anniversary. Every detail echoed familiarity, only now rewritten with someone else in her place. Amara's hands shook, but her mind went still. Clarity, cold and precise, took over. She took screenshots, forwarded them to her personal email, then placed the phone down gently, as if setting a weapon on a table. For a moment she thought she might scream or cry or throw something, but instead she walked to the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and washed her hands. The motion was absurdly normal. The water ran clear at first, then pink from a cut she hadn't noticed. A thin slice from the broken glass. Her blood, her reflection, the quiet, all of it blurred together into something that felt like a reckoning. She looked up at her reflection. The woman staring back at her wasn't broken. She was awake. Later that night, she went into Ethan's office. The lights were dim, the room smelling faintly of cigar smoke and ambition. She sat at his desk, the one he never let her use, and opened his laptop. A few keystrokes later, she was inside his email. There it was, confirmation, receipts, reservations, wire transfers. Her husband hadn't just betrayed her, he'd funded it with their shared money. A vacation to Paris, jewelry she'd never seen, lavish dinners charged to their joint account. Amara laughed then, a sound dry and disbelieving, not from humor, but from the absurdity of it all. The man who lectured her about smart spending had turned their fortune into a playground for his ego. Her laughter turned to silence, and in that silence, resolve was born. By 3 a.m., she had gathered everything. Screenshots, receipts, dates. She stored them in a password-protected drive labeled simply, Clarity. Then she shut the laptop, turned off the lights, and stood in the dark, her heartbeat echoing like a drum in her chest. She walked to the window. Below, Atlanta glittered, thousands of lives stacked in light. Somewhere out there, Ethan was asleep in another woman's bed, believing she would never find out, believing she was still the same woman who smiled through disrespect to protect an image. But something had shifted. The air felt different now. She could taste iron in her mouth, the flavor of resolve, sharp and undeniable. She thought about the years she'd spent building, her company, her reputation, her marriage, how much she had invested in holding everything together, and how liberating it felt, in that moment, to stop pretending. At dawn, she sat on the balcony with her coffee, watching the horizon turn gold. When Ethan finally returned home, his tie undone, his expression casual, she didn't say a word. He leaned down to kiss her cheek. She turned slightly, his lips brushing the air instead. "Rough night?" she asked, voice calm, eyes on the sunrise. He hesitated. "Meetings ran late." "I'm sure they did." He didn't notice the subtle shift in her tone, that chilling steadiness that comes before a storm. When he disappeared into the shower, Amara looked toward the closed bathroom door and whispered under her breath, You have no idea what you've started. Because what he had mistaken for forgiveness was preparation. The woman who once built an empire beside him was about to build one without him. And this time, she wouldn't be sharing the throne. The first light of morning spilled across her face, and for the first time in months, Amara smiled. Not from happiness, but from power reclaimed. Every truth she'd uncovered that night had been a weapon forged in betrayal, and she planned to use every single one. The morning after she discovered the affair, Amara Cole didn't cry. She didn't scream, or break, or even confront him. She went to work. Not to her company's headquarters, the glass-walled sanctuary she'd built with her name etched on the lobby plaque, but to another kind of office, a quiet one, tucked away in a restored brick building off Peachtree Street. The name on the door read, Vivian Hale and Associates. Family law, discretion guaranteed. Vivian Hale was a legend, the kind of woman who could dismantle a billionaire's ego with a single sentence. Her hair was silver, her heels sharp, her tone sharper. Rumors said she'd once made a senator weep in mediation. Amara had met her years ago at a women's leadership event. She remembered Vivian's closing words, "Never start a war without knowing you can win. And never, ever let emotion be your general." Now, as Amara stepped into her office, Vivian looked up from her desk with a small, knowing smile. "Well," she said, gesturing to a chair, "you wouldn't be here if you weren't ready to fight." Amara sat, spine straight, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I'm done being polite," she said quietly. Vivian nodded once. "Then let's begin." The next 2 hours unfolded like a chess match. Amara laid out everything, the texts, the photos, the receipts. Vivian took notes without a flicker of surprise, her pen gliding across the paper with surgical precision. "You have proof," she said finally, leaning back in her chair. "Good. But that's not enough. You need strategy." Amara met her gaze. "I want my company protected. I want him out of my finances. I don't want his shadow anywhere near what I've built." Vivian smiled slightly, a glint of admiration in her eyes. "You're not the first woman to walk through my door with a broken heart, but you might be the first to walk in with a business plan." Over the following days, Amara transformed her pain into preparation. Her penthouse became her war room. Documents spread across the dining table, her laptop glowing into the early hours. She studied contracts, traced fund transfers, and mapped out every legal thread connecting her empire to his. Vivian called her daily. "We'll move quietly," she instructed. "You don't show your hand until the table is set. Let him think you're still his wife, still loyal. That's how you win." Amara played the part flawlessly. At home, she greeted Ethan with calm smiles and soft questions. She laughed when he told his shallow stories, kissed his cheek when he left for business trips, and even hosted a dinner party for his partners, looking every bit the supportive spouse. But beneath the polished veneer, she was documenting everything, tracking timelines, financial shifts, even subtle changes in his behavior. Each piece of evidence was a weapon waiting to be drawn. Late one night, Vivian called. "You've done enough gathering," she said. "It's time we build the case. And I think you'll like this part." "What part is that?" Amara asked. "The part where we take back what's yours and make him realize what he's lost." That weekend, Amara met Vivian and her legal team in a downtown suite converted into a temporary operations center. The walls were covered with timelines, charts, and folders labeled assets, public exposure, liabilities. Vivian pointed to one chart. "Here's the situation. His firm holds partial shares in ArcLight through a joint fund. But based on these transactions you found, we can prove he's been moving money without disclosure. That's a breach of fiduciary duty." Amara nodded slowly. "Meaning?" "Meaning we can freeze his assets before he even knows we're coming for them." For the first time in weeks, Amara felt something fierce stir inside her. Not just satisfaction, but power. As the night stretched on, strategy replaced sorrow. Vivian's team drafted legal filings. Amara cross-checked data with surgical precision. They spoke not of revenge, but of precision strikes. Every move had purpose. Every document, a consequence. At one point, Vivian looked up from her papers. "Do you ever miss him?" Amara paused. The question caught her off guard. "I miss who I thought he was," she said softly. But that man never existed. He was a mirror, reflecting back the version of me he needed to feel powerful. Vivian gave a small, approving smile. Good. Hold on to that clarity. It's your shield. By dawn, the plan was set. Vivian would file the preliminary motion discreetly on Monday. Ethan wouldn't know until his credit lines began to blink red, his legal inbox flooded with documents that stripped away his control. When Amara left the suite, the city was still asleep. The streets glistened with rain, the air cool and sharp. She walked slowly to her car, heels clicking against the pavement, each step deliberate, steady, unshaken. In her reflection on a nearby window, she no longer saw the woman who had wept in silence. She saw a strategist, a survivor, a storm in heels. The next day, she arrived at her office as if nothing had changed. Her employees greeted her with warm smiles. She greeted them back, radiant and composed. But inside, she carried a secret, the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had stopped waiting for justice and started building it. That evening, as she and Ethan sat at dinner, he mentioned casually, "I might have to fly out to New York this week. Big investor meeting." Amara smiled, her tone effortless. "That's fine, love. Just make sure you check your accounts before you go." He laughed, confused, and reached for his wine. She met his gaze across the table, poised, serene, lethal in her calm. She didn't need to raise her voice. The war had already begun. In the weeks to come, headlines would whisper about the sudden shakeup in Ethan Walker's firm, the internal audit, the missing millions, the mysterious investor withdrawal. But that was still ahead. For now, the battlefield was invisible, the moves silent. And in the heart of Atlanta, under the dim glow of city lights, Amara Cole was becoming something Ethan could never have imagined. Not just a woman scorned, but a woman unleashed. Her vengeance wasn't fire. It was calculation. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. And as the first cracks of his downfall began to echo through the marble halls of his empire, Amara sat in her war room, calm as a queen before battle, whispering to herself, "Let him underestimate me one last time." Winter descended on Savannah with a deceptive softness. Gold light over cobblestone, mist curling around iron gates, the air tasting faintly of salt and secrets. The city seemed dressed for intrigue, and that night, so was Amara Cole. The Southern Innovators Gala was the event of the season, a gathering of power, money, and influence beneath the chandeliers of the historic Devereaux Hall. Ethan Walker was set to be one of the evening's honorary hosts, and Amara, newly composed and unreadable, accepted her invitation without hesitation. It had been 3 months since she discovered his affair. In those 90 days, she had built a fortress of silence. Legal documents filed discreetly, assets restructured, the threads of his financial web quietly rewoven around her control. Ethan still didn't know. He still thought she was his wife, compliant and content. Tonight would be the first time they'd be seen together publicly since the storm began brewing behind closed doors. But Amara didn't come to play the loyal partner. She came to deliver a message, not in words but in poise. When she entered the ballroom, heads turned. Her gown was black satin, sculpted and severe. Her hair swept into a crown of curls, gold at her throat catching the light like armor. She looked every inch the woman the world had once mistaken as a footnote to a man's legacy. Only now, she was the headline. Ethan was already there, surrounded by admirers, glass in hand, laughter easy. Lila wasn't beside him. Not yet, but Amara knew she would appear. Secrets never stayed buried when ego was involved. Vivian had called it a controlled confrontation. "Smile," she'd said. "Be gracious. Let him believe the performance is his. The louder he plays, the clearer his guilt becomes." And so, Amara smiled. When Ethan saw her across the room, he froze for a fraction of a second, the kind of pause that betrays guilt. Then came the charm, quick and rehearsed. He approached, all warmth and expensive cologne. "You look incredible," he murmured, leaning to kiss her cheek. "I know," she replied softly. "How's business?" "Busy," he said, too quickly. "You know how it is." "Oh, I do," she said, her tone silk over steel. "In fact, I've been quite busy myself lately." Restructuring some things. You'll be surprised. He frowned slightly, but before he could ask, the host called for attention. The lights dimmed, the string quartet hushed, and the evening's presentation began. Ethan was next to speak, a keynote about innovation, integrity, and the future of venture capital. The irony didn't escape her. She took her seat at the front, crossing her legs elegantly, every inch of her posture a quiet defiance. Halfway through his speech, she saw her. Lila entered the ballroom, late, flustered, wearing a cream silk gown that shimmered under the chandeliers. Too polished for an assistant, too familiar in her discomfort. And Ethan's eyes, betraying him before he could hide it, flickered toward her with instinctive recognition. The moment was subtle, barely there, but to anyone watching closely, the spark between them was undeniable. A whisper rippled through the crowd, nothing loud enough to name, just enough to notice. When the applause ended, Ethan descended the stage, smiling at donors, shaking hands. Lila drifted toward the corner, pretending to mingle, eyes avoiding Amara's gaze. Amara rose and moved with purpose, her heels echoing across marble. She approached Lila slowly, offering a smile that was equal parts grace and danger. "Lila, isn't it?" she said softly. "We've met before. You worked with Ethan." Lila's breath caught. "Yes, Mrs. Walker. It's good to see you." Amara tilted her head, studying her. "You've done quite well for yourself. Promotions come fast these days, I see." Lila's cheeks flushed. Yes, I've been fortunate." "Fortune," Amara murmured. "It's funny, isn't it? It always comes with a cost. You'll learn that eventually." Before Lila could respond, Ethan appeared, tension flickering behind his polished smile. "Amara, I was just looking for you," he said quickly. "I'm sure you were," she replied, turning to him. "But you looked occupied." His jaw tightened. "Can we talk privately?" "Of course," she smiled sweetly. "There's something I wanted to show you anyway." They moved to a small terrace overlooking the river. The night air was sharp, the city lights flickering below like a mirror of stars. Ethan spoke first. "What was that inside?" "Honesty," she said simply. He exhaled, frustrated. "Amara, this is ridiculous. You're overanalyzing everything." "Am I?" She stepped closer, her voice low. "You think I don't know? About the texts, the trips, the lies?" He froze, eyes narrowing. "You've been spying on me?" "I've been watching you," she corrected. "The difference is consent. You took mine away the moment you turned our marriage into a performance." He started to speak, but she cut him off. "Don't insult me with excuses, Ethan. You didn't fall in love with someone else. You fell in love with how she made you feel. Powerful again. Small men always confuse attention for adoration." The silence that followed was thick. The river below shimmered, and from the ballroom the music swelled. A waltz, elegant and ironic. Ethan's voice dropped, almost pleading. "We can fix this." Amara smiled sadly. "No, Ethan. You can't fix what you never valued." She reached into her clutch, pulled out her phone, and tapped the screen. A recording began to play. His voice, unmistakable, from a conversation he'd had with Lila in a hotel room. "I'll tell her after the holidays, I promise. She deserves someone better. You." Ethan went pale. "Where did you—" "Don't worry," she interrupted. "I'm not sending it anywhere. Yet." His eyes darted, calculating. "What do you want, Amara?" She turned, her voice calm, deliberate. "I don't want anything. I already have everything that's mine. This," she gestured between them. "This is just the final mask coming off." Then she walked back inside, leaving him on the terrace, a man stripped of his illusions. As she re-entered the ballroom, the chandelier light caught her face. Conversations paused, eyes followed. Some saw elegance, others saw power. But no one saw the tremor that briefly crossed her expression, the quiet sorrow of a woman who had finally stopped hoping. The orchestra began to play again, a slow, haunting melody. Amara stood at the edge of the dance floor, watching couples spin beneath the golden light. The masquerade had served its purpose. The truth was no longer hidden, not from her, not from him, not from anyone who mattered. And as the music swelled, she realized something profound. Her heartbreak was no longer her burden, it was her armor. The mask had shattered, The woman beneath it was finally free. The morning the papers were delivered, the city was wrapped in fog, the kind that muffles sound, softens outlines, and makes everything seem suspended, like the world itself was holding its breath. Ethan Walker didn't yet know that the fog was for him. He was in a board meeting at his firm's downtown office. The top floor, the one with the skyline view and the imported mahogany table that gleamed like a mirror. Around him sat his partners and investors, men who'd once admired his effortless confidence, the way he could make any deal sound like destiny. Today, his voice carried that same ease, but underneath it, the cracks had begun to show. He didn't notice the courier at first. The man in a gray suit who entered quietly, slid a sleek envelope across the polished table and murmured, "For Mr. Walker, personal delivery." Ethan frowned, irritation flashing briefly. "I'm in a meeting." The courier simply nodded. "It's time-sensitive, sir." Then he left. Ethan tore open the envelope with a sharp flick of his wrist. Inside was a single document stamped with the seal of Vivian Hale and Associates. The first page bore the words, "Petition for dissolution of marriage. Amara Cole Walker versus Ethan James Walker." The room went still. Across the table, one of the partners cleared his throat softly. Ethan's face drained of color, the charm evaporating. He skimmed the first few lines, and then the attachments, the numbers, the financial disclosures, the references to unauthorized fund transfers. Each page was a blade. By the time he reached the final paragraph, the clause freezing his access to several key accounts, he wasn't reading anymore. He was sinking. Outside, the fog began to lift. Inside, Ethan's empire started to crumble. When Amara received Vivian's call, confirming the delivery, she was in her office. Not in tears, not gloating, just still. "It's done," Vivian said. "He's officially served. His firm will be notified within the hour." Amara closed her eyes. "Good. You might want to stay off the news for the rest of the day," Vivian added. "They'll smell blood soon." But Amara didn't mind. She knew what headlines would come. Power couple splits amid allegations of misconduct. She'd lived long enough in Ethan's shadow to understand how the world loved the spectacle of a fallen man and the myth of the woman who brought him down. Still, this wasn't revenge. Not really. It was reclamation. Of truth, of dignity, of self. By noon, Ethan's phone was vibrating nonstop. Reporters, investors, attorneys. One of his senior partners, a man he'd mentored for years, pulled him aside. "Tell me this isn't true," he said quietly, holding up a printed article. Financial misconduct allegations surface at Walker and Hale Capital. Ethan's lips parted, but no words came out. The investigation had begun. Vivian's filings were timed perfectly. Legal, financial, and media pressure synchronized like gears in motion. For every lie Ethan had told Amara, she had built a truth precise enough to dismantle him. That afternoon, he drove home in silence. The penthouse, once a monument to their success, now felt cavernous. Amara's presence lingered in small things. Her perfume in the air, a silk scarf draped over the sofa, a half-empty cup of coffee on the counter. She wasn't there. She hadn't been for days. Her things, he realized, were carefully chosen. What remained were traces, not possessions. Every absence was deliberate. He poured himself a drink. His hands trembled. For the first time, the reflection staring back at him wasn't the invincible man the world knew. It was a man who'd built his throne on someone else's foundation, and now stood watching the cracks spread beneath his feet. He picked up his phone, called her. She answered after 2 rings. Her voice was calm. "Ethan." "Amara, what are you doing?" His tone wavered between disbelief and fury. "You blindsided me. You could have talked to me." "I tried," she said evenly. "You just never listened. This is nuclear. You're destroying everything." "No," she replied. "I'm just removing myself from the wreckage you built." He let out a sharp breath. "You won't win this." Her silence stretched long enough to sting. Then, "Ethan, I already have." The line went dead. That evening, as news of the divorce and financial scandal broke, the city's digital feeds lit up. Ethan's photo, smiling, golden, the embodiment of Southern charm, appeared beside words like fraud, misconduct, and marital infidelity. The men who'd once toasted his success began to distance themselves. Clients requested audits. Partners whispered about dissolution. Even his parents, old money Charleston royalty, stopped returning his calls. In a single day, the myth of Ethan Walker collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance. Across town, Amara sat with Vivian in a quiet corner booth of a small jazz bar. The music was soft, the lights low. "To the beginning of your piece," Vivian said, raising her glass. Amara hesitated. "It doesn't feel like victory." "It isn't," Vivian replied. "It's truth. And truth never feels good when you've lived too long inside a lie." Amara smiled faintly, her gaze drifting to the stage where a saxophonist played a slow, aching melody. "He'll survive this," Vivian added. Men like him always do. "But he'll never rise the same way again." "I don't want him destroyed," Amara said quietly. "Just exposed. I needed the world to see what I saw all along." Vivian studied her for a moment. "And now?" "Now," Amara said, exhaling softly, "I build something new, something clean." The saxophone wept through the room, raw, imperfect, beautiful. The next morning, Ethan walked into his firm for what would be the last time. Reporters waited outside, cameras flashed. Inside, his partners handed him a sealed envelope. Termination, effective immediately. He stared at the words until they blurred. For a brief, almost human moment, he thought of Amara, her laughter, her fierce intelligence, the way she'd once believed in him. And for the first time, he understood what he'd truly lost. It wasn't his company. It wasn't his reputation. It was the woman who had built him, loved him, and finally dismantled him with the same precision she'd once used to build their empire. By the end of that day, Ethan Walker was no longer the king of anything. And somewhere high above the city, in her new office overlooking the skyline, Amara Cole signed a contract that made her the sole owner of ArcLight Technologies. No longer a queen beside a king, but a kingdom standing on her own. The week after Ethan's fall, Atlanta burned, not in flames, but in whispers. Every cafe conversation, every boardroom murmur, every social headline carried her name, Amara Cole. Some said she was ruthless. Others called her brave. Most called her dangerous. For the first time, the woman who had once been invisible behind a man's charisma had become the story. But public power is a double-edged light. It illuminates and it blinds. The press spun her into archetypes faster than she could breathe. The betrayed wife, the avenger, the genius, the ice queen. Everyone wanted to own a piece of her narrative, to define what kind of woman she was. None of them knew the truth. She didn't want to be anyone's symbol. She just wanted peace. The media storm grew louder. Ethan's firm was collapsing under investigations. His name was now a cautionary tale. But in every article about his downfall, Amara's image appeared beside his. Elegant, unflinching, eyes that gave nothing away. She had become both hero and target. On social media, they dissected her every outfit, every expression. Some women called her an icon. Some men called her bitter. Strangers projected their own stories onto hers. Because nothing makes the internet hungrier than a woman who wins her freedom. One morning, as she prepared for a meeting, Leah, her assistant, hesitated at the doorway. "You should see this," she said, holding up a tablet. A headline, "The Angry Black Woman Who Broke Atlanta's Power Couple." Amara's jaw tightened. The article praised her intelligence while subtly punishing her for it. Every word dripped with coded venom. Assertive, unyielding, calculating. The writer couldn't decide whether to admire her or fear her. She read it once, set the tablet down, and said quietly, "Let them talk." But later, in the privacy of her penthouse, the words echoed louder than she expected. Because she'd fought her whole life not just for success, but for legitimacy, for the right to exist in power without being labeled a threat. Now, she had both power and threat, and she hated that they'd become inseparable. That night, she dreamed of glass again, her reflection fractured, light scattering into 1,000 pieces. When she woke, she understood. She was no longer breaking. She was being reshaped. 2 days later, her publicist begged her to make a statement. "Control the narrative, Amara. Tell your version before someone else does." So she did, but not through press conferences or interviews. Instead, she sat alone in her office, opened her laptop, and began to write. The essay was titled "The Cost of Silence." She didn't write about Ethan. She didn't name names or recount betrayals. She wrote about what it meant to shrink yourself for love, about the invisible negotiations women make every day, in boardrooms, bedrooms, and mirrors, about how success doesn't protect you from pain. It just teaches you to hide it better. Her words were not polished. They were raw, personal, almost surgical in their honesty. When she finished, she sent it to The Atlantic. She didn't expect them to publish it, but they did. Within hours of its release, it went viral. Women shared it across platforms with captions like, "She said what we've all felt." Men argued in the comments. Editors called it the manifesto of modern womanhood. But Amara didn't read the praise or the outrage. She went for a drive. Atlanta's skyline gleamed against the dusk, towers of glass catching fire from the sunset. She parked near the river, rolled down her window, and let the air hit her face. The city she'd once conquered now felt both enormous and intimate, like it was finally seeing her for who she was. Still, beneath the calm, something heavy lingered. Vivian had warned her. Power has an aftertaste. It's sweet at first, but it burns going down. The burn came in waves. Lawsuits, countersuits, accusations of manipulation. Ethan's lawyers claimed she'd engineered the scandal. Online pundits called her success revenge-fueled. But Amara never defended herself publicly. She didn't need to. Every false story only revealed who was threatened by her truth. Behind closed doors, though, the exhaustion showed. Some nights she'd find herself staring at old photos, the two of them at a gala, at home, smiling in that polished way of people pretending to be perfect. She'd delete the image, only to find it reappearing in her mind hours later. That's the thing about survival. It doesn't erase the ache. It teaches you to live alongside it. One evening, Vivian joined her at home. "You look tired," she said, pouring 2 glasses of wine. "I am." "You won, Amara." "I didn't want to win," she replied softly. "I just didn't want to lose myself." Vivian studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then don't. Not now, not ever." They sat in silence, the city below pulsing with light. The next morning, Amara returned to ArcLight's headquarters. Her employees stood taller when she entered, not out of fear, but out of recognition. They'd watched her walk through fire and come out shining, not because she was unscathed, but because she'd learned how to glow through the cracks. She called a meeting, not about business, but about belief. "Everyone here knows what we've been through," she said. "The world watched us burn, but they missed the point. The fire wasn't destruction, it was transformation. If you've ever been underestimated, overworked, or overlooked, let this company be proof that you don't have to apologize for your light." The room went still. Then someone began to clap, then another. Soon the sound swelled, not for a boss, but for a woman who had dared to be human in public. After the meeting, Amara stepped outside onto the balcony. The air smelled of rain and concrete and new beginnings. Her phone buzzed, an unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something in her gut told her to answer. "Amara," a familiar voice said. It was Ethan. "I read your essay," he murmured. "You made me look like a monster." "You did that yourself," she said. Silence. Then, more quietly, "You were right about everything." She didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. When the call ended, she stared out at the horizon. The storm had passed, but the glass was still warm from the flames. She thought of all the versions of herself that had died along the way. The dreamer, the believer, the wife. And she realized something beautiful and terrifying all at once. Each version had broken to make space for the next. The city stretched before her like a mirror made of light, and for the first time she saw herself clearly, not as what she'd lost, but as what she'd become. Fire and glass, strength and reflection. A woman reborn in her own brilliance. The night the idea came to her, Amara couldn't sleep. The city outside her window was a shimmer of restless lights. Cars threading through the dark, planes whispering across the horizon, a skyline pulsing like a living thing. Atlanta never slept, and neither did she. 3 months had passed since the storm. The scandal had cooled, the lawyers had quieted, and the media's obsession had moved on to the next fire. But for Amara, Silence was not peace. It was the sound of transition, the stillness before something new began to breathe. She sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by scattered notebooks and the faint smell of espresso. In front of her, a blank page waited. She wrote a single word in the center: rebirth. Her company, Arclight Technologies, was thriving again. But Amara had no desire to return to the same rhythm. Profit, growth, acclaim. That world felt small now, mechanical. She wanted purpose, something that burned brighter than revenge and lasted longer than validation. That's when she thought of the women she'd met along the way, the ones who'd written to her after her essay went viral. Women from Detroit, from Lagos, from New Orleans. Coders, artists, single mothers, dreamers. Each one telling her the same story in different words. I have the talent, but not the opportunity. I have the fire, but no oxygen. That was the moment the Phoenix Plan was born. It would be more than a fund. It would be a movement. A venture capital initiative designed to invest in underrepresented women founders, not as charity, but as equity. Not pity, but partnership. The tagline formed in her mind like a spark catching flame. We rise together, or not at all. The next morning, she called Vivian. I want to start something new, she said, something bigger than me. Vivian smiled over the phone, that knowing smile of a woman who'd seen battles turn into revolutions. Then start it. But make sure it's built from your truth, not your anger. Amara paused. It's not anger anymore, Viv. It's clarity. Weeks later, in a sleek downtown conference room, she stood before a group of potential investors, all women, CEOs, founders, philanthropists, some skeptical, some intrigued. Amara began not with numbers, but with a story, her own. She told them about Detroit, about coding on a secondhand laptop, about building a company beside a man who'd mistaken her strength for decoration, about losing everything that wasn't real and discovering everything that was. When she finished, the room was silent. Then one of the women, a tech executive from San Francisco, leaned forward and said softly, So what do you need? Amara smiled. Faith and capital. They both laughed. It was the beginning of something seismic. By summer, the Phoenix Plan launched. Within weeks, it had drawn attention from every major publication that had once only cared about her divorce. This time, they wrote about her vision. The narrative had shifted. Amara Cole was no longer the woman who dismantled a man's empire. She was the woman building one of her own, inclusive, sustainable, unstoppable. Still, behind the headlines and board meetings, she remained grounded. She spent long nights reviewing applications from women around the world. Reading their dreams felt like reading fragments of herself. Ambition wrapped in fear. Brilliance starved of validation. One application stood out. A 27-year-old software engineer from Alabama named Tasha, who'd built an app to connect rural schools with online tutors. The prototype was scrappy, the code imperfect, but the purpose was pure. Amara funded her personally, calling it an experiment in faith. When Tasha's app later gained national attention, Amara smiled quietly. That was the point, to pass the torch and never look back. But success always summons ghosts. One evening, as Amara prepared for an investor dinner, she received a message. Unknown number. A simple text. Marcus Reed. It's been a long time. I read your essay. You still write like you mean it. Marcus, the journalist from her college days, the one who'd once believed in her before the world did. He was now a senior writer at the New York Times. They met a week later at a cafe near Piedmont Park. Marcus looked almost the same, sharp eyes, a quiet confidence that felt like gravity. I thought you'd disappeared into the clouds, he said, smiling. I did, she replied, but fire has a way of bringing you back down. They talked for hours, about old dreams, lost time, and the strange cost of visibility. Marcus listened more than he spoke, and when he did, it wasn't about the scandal. It was about her. Do you ever get tired of being strong? He asked at one point. Amara looked out at the skyline. Every day, but strength stopped being a choice a long time ago. He nodded, understanding without pity. That night, when she returned home, Her thoughts were quieter than usual. For the first time in a long while, the idea of companionship didn't feel like compromise. It felt like air. Months passed. The Phoenix plan grew faster than anyone predicted. Within a year, it had funded 30 startups across 4 continents. Each founder carried Amara's story like a shared flame, proof that breaking doesn't mean ending. But even as her empire expanded, she remained private, detached from spectacle. Her name no longer trended online, and that was how she liked it. True legacy, she had learned, isn't loud. It's enduring. On the first anniversary of the fund's launch, she hosted a dinner for all the women whose startups had flourished. It wasn't in a ballroom or a penthouse. It was in a converted warehouse in West Midtown. Raw brick, string lights, jazz in the background. They ate, laughed, cried. Stories filled the air like music. And when one young founder toasted her, "To Amara, the woman who taught us to rise from fire," she felt something she hadn't felt in years: wholeness. After the dinner, she stepped outside alone. The night was warm, the air heavy with magnolia. She looked up at the stars and whispered, almost to herself, "You were right, Mama. The world doesn't give you wings. You build them." The wind caught her curls, lifting them gently. Behind her, through the open door, the laughter of women echoed, strong, defiant, alive. And for the first time since the night she watched her marriage burn, Amara Cole didn't feel like she was rebuilding. She felt like she was finally flying. The invitation arrived in a white envelope embossed with gold, the same as it had all those years ago. The Southern Innovators Gala. Same city, same chandeliers, same stage where her marriage had first begun to fracture beneath the weight of performance. Amara held the card between her fingers for a long while, the faintest smile touching her lips. The irony was almost poetic. The last time she'd walked those marble floors, she was a wife pretending not to bleed. This time, she would return as herself, whole, sovereign, untouchable. She didn't hesitate. She RSVP'd yes. The night of the gala, the Devereaux Hall glowed again. All glass, gold, and whispers. The kind of event where old money met new ambition, and the air crackled with unspoken hierarchy. Only this time, Amara Cole wasn't attending as someone's guest. She was the keynote speaker. The theme, innovation and the future of ethical leadership. If the committee had chosen the title deliberately, she didn't mind. She'd long stopped fearing the weight of a story told in public. After all, she had already survived its worst version. When she entered the ballroom, the room stilled. Not from scandal this time, but reverence. Heads turned the way they do for royalty or miracles. She wore a white silk gown that shimmered with movement, her curls cascading like light. Confidence radiated from her like heat. She moved with grace, acknowledging people with polite nods, offering smiles that revealed nothing and suggested everything. Those who had once pitied her now looked at her with awe, and perhaps a tinge of envy. At the far end of the room she saw him, Ethan Walker. Older now, thinner. The effortless charm he once carried had faded into something strained, defensive. He stood near the bar, clutching a glass of scotch like an anchor, and beside him, though no longer touching him, was Lila. Amara took in the scene quietly, the corner of her mouth lifting. The king who'd once thought himself untouchable now stood in exile in his own kingdom. She didn't avert her gaze. She walked straight toward them. "Ethan," she said softly, when she reached him. He turned, startled. For a moment, he looked like a man remembering a dream he'd once ruined. "Amara," he said, voice low, "you look radiant." "I know." Lila shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward the floor. She'd lost her sheen too. No longer the wide-eyed assistant chasing golden illusions. Now she looked like someone who'd learned too late that proximity to power isn't the same as possessing it. "I didn't think you'd come," Ethan said after a pause. "Of course you didn't," Amara replied, calm, cool. "You never did expect me to return to the rooms you thought you owned." His jaw tightened. "You've made your point, Amara. You won." "This was never a competition," she said. "You lost long before I ever needed to win." The words were soft, but they landed like a blade. She could see it in the flicker of his expression. the flash of regret too late to matter. She excused herself with a polite nod, leaving him standing amidst the noise and glitter that once defined him. When her turn came to speak, the audience rose in applause even before she began. She stood at the podium, eyes sweeping over a sea of faces: investors, innovators, journalists, dreamers. The same audience that had once applauded Ethan. Her voice carried through the hall like music, low and steady. "Years ago," she began, "I stood in this very room believing that success was about proximity, to power, to influence, to belonging. I thought that being seen meant being safe. I was wrong." The room fell utterly silent. Success means nothing if it costs you your peace. Power means nothing if it's built on fear. And love, real love, can only exist where truth is free to breathe. Her gaze softened, sweeping the audience. "I lost everything that once defined me. My marriage, my reputation, even my certainty. But in that loss, I found something far greater: clarity, the freedom to build again, this time without apology." A murmur rippled through the crowd, the kind born of recognition, that quiet ache of hearing your own story echoed by a stranger. Amara continued, her words measured, lyrical. "We all wear masks. We wear them for acceptance, for ambition, for survival. But the moment you remove yours, the moment you stop performing, that's when you truly rise. That's when your story begins." When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Not polite, not performative, genuine. People rose to their feet, clapping, some even wiping tears. In the corner of the room, Ethan remained seated, his hands still, his eyes fixed on her. There was no anger in his expression, only the hollow quiet of understanding. Later, as the gala wound down, Amara stood alone on the balcony overlooking the river. The same spot where years ago she'd confronted the man who broke her heart. The night was cool, the air carrying a faint hum of jazz from inside. She closed her eyes for a moment and exhaled. The ghosts were finally quiet. A voice spoke behind her, warm, familiar. "You always did have a way with words." She turned. Marcus Reed stood there, hands in his pockets, that easy half-smile on his lips. "I didn't know you were here," she said. "I wouldn't have missed it," he replied. "Your speech will be everywhere by morning." She laughed softly. "Then I suppose some stories really do circle back." They stood in silence for a while, watching the water move, dark and endless and full of reflections. Marcus glanced at her. "Does it feel different this time?" "Yes," she said, "because I'm not performing anymore." He nodded. "You're free. Finally." He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that didn't ask for permission, only understanding. "So what happens now?" Amara turned back to the city, the skyline burning with light. "Now," she said softly, "now I live." Inside, the music swelled again. The gala sparkled on. But out here, beneath the stars and the hum of the river, Amara Cole stood reborn. Not as a symbol, not as a survivor, but as a woman at peace with her own reflection. The queen had returned to the ballroom, not for revenge, but for closure. And she left it not as someone's wife, or scandal, or savior, but as her own beginning. The phone call came on a quiet Thursday evening. Rain traced soft lines down the tall windows of Amara's apartment, the city lights bleeding into the glass like watercolor. She had been working late, reviewing proposals for the next wave of Phoenix investments, when her phone vibrated across the desk. Ethan Walker. The name pulsed on the screen like a ghost that hadn't learned how to stay dead. For a long moment, she just stared at it. Years of silence had passed since their last real conversation. The legal battles, the interviews, the headlines. He'd vanished into obscurity, his empire dismantled, his reputation fractured into dust. Against her better judgment, she answered, "Amara." His voice was softer than she remembered, stripped of its old polish, its practiced charm. "I didn't know if you'd pick up." "I almost didn't." A pause. The rain outside deepened, a steady percussion against the glass. "I just wanted to talk," he said. "No agenda, no lawyers, just a conversation." She exhaled slowly. "After everything, you still think you get to ask for that?" "I don't know what I think anymore," he admitted. "But I'm in Atlanta for a few days. There's something I'd like to give you, in person." Amara hesitated. Every instinct told her to hang up, But curiosity, that dangerous thread that ties the past to the present, tugged at her. "Tomorrow," she said finally. "No promises." They met the next afternoon at a small cafe on the east side of town, one she used to love for its quiet corners and unfussy charm. When she arrived, Ethan was already there. He stood as she entered, hands tucked nervously into his coat pockets. The sight of him startled her, not because he looked the same, but because he didn't. The tailored arrogance was gone. His suit was simple, his face lined with humility and something that resembled regret. "Amara," he said, offering a small, uncertain smile. "You look, well." "I am," she said simply, sliding into the seat across from him. The silence between them was almost physical. Years of shared history, both beautiful and brutal, lingered in the air like perfume. "I've been following your work," he began. "The Phoenix Plan, the fund. You've built something extraordinary." She didn't look at him. "I built it because I had to." "I know," he said quietly, "and I destroyed what I should have protected." Her eyes met his then, cool and steady. "You didn't just destroy us, Ethan. You tried to erase me. But you can't erase a woman who learns to write her own story." He winced but nodded. "You're right. I have no excuse. But I need you to know. I'm sorry. For everything. Not just for what I did, but for who I was." Amara studied him. There was sincerity there, buried under guilt and the weight of years. She'd once longed for those words, begged the universe for them in sleepless nights. Now they felt small, like flowers left on a grave long after the mourner had moved on. "I don't hate you anymore," she said finally. "I don't have space for that. You were a chapter, Ethan. I've turned the page." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I deserve that." They sat in silence for a while, the rain still whispering against the window. Finally, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "I found this while cleaning out storage," he said. "It's yours." Inside was an old photograph, the two of them standing in front of their first office, before the money, before the fame. She was in jeans and a t-shirt, hair tied back, eyes lit with unfiltered joy. He was looking at her, not the camera. Amara's throat tightened. For a fleeting second, she remembered that girl, the one who believed partnership meant protection, the one who hadn't yet learned that love could also be ambition, disguised as affection. "Keep it," she said softly, sliding the photo back across the table. "That's your memory, not mine." He looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing her for the first time. "You know, you were always the better half of us." "No," she said gently. "I was the whole thing. You just never noticed." A small, sad smile crossed his face. "You're right. I didn't." He stood to leave but hesitated. "I'm heading to Charleston after this. My mother's sick. I might stay there a while. Start over if I can." Amara nodded. "I hope you do." He linked. That night, Amara returned home and poured herself a glass of wine. The photograph still haunted her thoughts. Not the image itself, but the feeling it carried. The echo of a life that no longer existed. She walked to her balcony. The city spread out below her in lights and hum. Somewhere beyond the noise, a train wailed, low and distant, like memory itself. She thought of the past not with pain, but with a strange tenderness. Every betrayal, every heartbreak, every sleepless night had been a teacher. Every scar had been a map. And somewhere along the way, she had stopped running from the echoes. She'd learned to let them play, not as reminders of loss, but as music that had led her here. Her phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. "Marcus, dinner tomorrow? You've been buried in work again." Amara smiled, setting her glass down. "Amara, maybe. I could use a good meal in better company." She turned back to the city, her reflection shimmering in the glass. Older, wiser, luminous, the woman she'd fought to become. Behind her, the echoes of the past finally softened into silence. And in that stillness, something new began to stir. Not the ache of what was lost, but the quiet thrill of what was still to come. The ballroom at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology glowed with quiet anticipation. Rows of polished seats filled with scholars, entrepreneurs, journalists, and students from every corner of the world. The occasion, the Global Entrepreneurship Summit, and at the center of the stage, waiting in the wings, was Amara Cole. Her name had been whispered across campuses and boardrooms for months. The woman who had redefined leadership, who'd turned betrayal into blueprint, who'd built empires from ashes. Tonight, she wasn't there to speak about innovation or technology. She was there to speak about something far rarer, the cost of becoming. Behind the curtain, Amara steadied her breath. It had been years since her last major public address. The headlines had quieted, the wounds had long scarred over. But stepping into the light again always carried the same weight, the awareness that her story, once shattered, was now a mirror for millions. The moderator's voice rang out through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Amara Cole. Applause rose like thunder. She walked onto the stage with poise that looked effortless, though it had been forged in fire. Dressed in a deep emerald suit, minimalist and strong, she stood behind the podium and looked out at the sea of expectant faces. The applause faded into silence. For a moment, she said nothing. She simply looked at them, young dreamers, older skeptics, founders, and fighters. Then she began. When I first entered the business world, she said, her voice low but resonant, I thought success was a race, that if I ran fast enough, worked hard enough, and stayed quiet enough, I could win. She paused, letting the words settle. But what I learned, the hard way, is that success built on silence is just a prettier form of surrender. A few heads nodded in the crowd. She smiled faintly, not as a performer, but as a storyteller returning home. When I was younger, I believed the world rewarded merit. Then I watched it reward ego. I believed love made us better. Then I learned that love without respect becomes a cage with velvet walls. And I believed that power protected you. But power, without purpose, just isolates you. She let her hands rest lightly on the podium. I lost everything once. My company, my marriage, my peace. The newspapers called it a scandal. I called it a rebirth. A murmur moved through the audience. Quiet awe, recognition. I've been asked 1,000 times what I learned from it, she continued. And my answer is simple. I learned that resilience is not about what you endure. It's about who you become once you stop enduring. The screen behind her flickered to life. Images of the women her Phoenix plan had funded. Scientists in Ghana, engineers in Chicago, artists in Mumbai. Their faces filled the screen like constellations. These women, Amara said, turning to look at the images, aren't just building companies. They're rewriting the rules of survival. They're proving that brilliance doesn't need permission to exist. The applause came soft at first, then stronger, but Amara lifted a hand gently. Not yet, she said with a small smile, because here's the truth no one likes to admit. Every woman you see succeeding has had to break something sacred to get there. Expectations, traditions, sometimes even herself. Her voice softened, intimate now, as if she were speaking not to a crowd but to one person who needed to hear her. When I was at my lowest, I thought I'd failed. But failure isn't falling apart. Failure is staying where you no longer belong. She took a slow breath, scanning the room. We talk so much about building, companies, wealth, legacy, but we don't talk about the cost, the sleepless nights, the self-doubt, the moments when you have to choose between being liked and being respected, between being loved and being free. The audience was utterly silent. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Amara stepped away from the podium now, speaking directly, her tones shifting from speech to confession. The world told me to smile more, to be softer, to forgive faster. But softness is not the same as kindness, and forgiveness doesn't mean returning to the fire that burned you. A young woman in the front row blinked back tears. A man near the back lowered his camera. Amara continued, what I've learned, and what I hope you remember, is that rebuilding your life is not about proving the world wrong. It's about proving yourself right. The moment you stop asking for permission to exist as you are, you begin to live. She paused again, then let her final words come slowly, deliberately, each syllable steady as a heartbeat. So if you ever find yourself standing in the wreckage of what used to be your life, don't rush to rebuild it exactly as it was. Let the fire teach you. Let the glass cut you just enough to remember. Because sometimes, destruction isn't punishment. It's invitation. The last word hung in the air like a prayer. For a long time, the room stayed still. Then the applause began. Not thunderous, but reverent. It grew, wave after wave, until even Amara felt its vibration deep in her chest. As she stepped back from the stage, she caught sight of Marcus standing near the wings. He'd flown in to cover the summit, though she suspected he didn't come just for the story. Their eyes met briefly, a quiet exchange, an understanding that needed no words. Later, after the session ended, Marcus found her by the corridor, the hum of applause still echoing down the hall. "You did it again," he said softly. "Did what?" "Reminded people that truth can be beautiful." Amara smiled. "Truth can also be brutal, but beauty doesn't exist without scars." He looked at her then, not as a journalist, not as a spectator, but as someone who'd seen her rebuild herself piece by piece. "You've changed," he said. "I've returned," she corrected, "to the person I was before the world told me who to be." They stood in silence as the crowd emptied, the last notes of applause fading into the night. Outside, Boston glimmered under soft rain. Amara tilted her head toward the sky, feeling the cool drops on her skin. The storm didn't scare her anymore. She'd already lived through worse. As they walked out together, she glanced back once at the grand hall, the lights dimming, the echoes fading. For years, that sound, applause, had meant validation. Tonight it meant something far greater. It meant peace. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, sealed in an ivory envelope, no return address. The handwriting on the front was familiar, elegant, steady, deliberate. Marcus Reed. Amara found it waiting at her desk when she returned from a meeting. For a moment, she simply stared at it, the weight of recognition sinking in. They had parted after the summit with promises to stay in touch, and though they had kept their word, texts, calls, the occasional dinner when their paths aligned, Marcus was not a man who wrote letters. He was a man who spoke carefully and wrote only when words had to last. She slid her finger under the flap and unfolded the crisp paper. His handwriting, precise, journalist's script, filled the page. There are some things that should be said on paper because paper doesn't vanish with a power outage or a deleted message. It endures, like truth or regret or gratitude. So I'm writing this because I want these words to endure. I've spent most of my life writing about other people's stories. I've chronicled ambition, failure, love, greed, all of it. But none of them have stayed with me the way yours has. Maybe because yours isn't just a story. It's a mirror. Amara leaned back in her chair. The city glowed faintly through the window, the late afternoon haze of Atlanta catching in glass towers. She began to read again, her pulse steady, but her breath shallow. "When I first saw you again at the gala, it wasn't nostalgia I felt. It was reverence. You stood in that room, the same one that had once witnessed your humiliation, and you turned it into a cathedral. Not through vengeance, but through grace. It was the most powerful thing I'd ever seen. People think strength is loud, Amara. They think it roars and dominates. But watching you has taught me that real strength whispers. It holds still when others crumble. It chooses truth when silence would be easier. I've watched you rebuild not just a life, but a world that welcomes others into its light. I've watched you forgive without forgetting, rise without revenge, love yourself without apology. And through it all, you've done something rare. You've remained kind." Her vision blurred slightly. She set the letter down for a moment, exhaling. It wasn't romantic in the way movies imagined. There were no confessions of longing, no declarations. It was something deeper, cleaner. It was understanding. She turned the page. "When you gave that keynote, I stood in the back of the hall and realized something I've never admitted. You taught me what integrity looks like. Not the moral kind they print on billboards, but the kind that lives in the quiet moments. The kind that stays even when no one is watching. I don't know if our paths were meant to cross again, or if the universe just owed us a second conversation. But I'm grateful for your story, for your courage, for the reminder that survival isn't enough. Living is. So if you ever wonder whether what you've built matters, it does. It matters more than you'll ever know. Because it doesn't just belong to you. It belongs to everyone who saw you fall and learned how to stand again. With respect and something that feels a lot like hope, Marcus." Amara's hand rested on the paper long after she'd finished reading. Outside, the sky had shifted from gold to gray. the slow approach of evening painting everything in soft contrast. She read it again, not to understand it, but to feel it. Every sentence carried weight, not of flattery but of truth. It reminded her of something her mother had once said. When someone sees you clearly, it's both a gift and a mirror. Don't look away. For years, she had trained herself to be seen on her own terms, through headlines, speeches, company profiles. But this was different. Marcus hadn't written to the public version of her. He'd written to the woman who existed when the world stopped watching. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the drawer beside her desk. Then, after a pause, she reached for her phone. Amara, I got your letter. Marcus, then you know. Amara, I do. Marcus, coffee tomorrow? No interviews, no speeches. Just two people who still believe in paper. Amara, I'd like that. The next morning, they met at a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop. One of those rare places that still smelled like roasted beans and ink. Marcus was already there, a notebook open beside his cup, pen tapping lightly against the table. When he saw her, his smile was quiet but certain. So, he said, did the letter make sense? It did, she replied, settling across from him. Maybe too much sense. They talked for hours, about everything and nothing, about the stories they'd written, the silences they'd survived, the strange peace that comes when ambition stops being armor. At one point, Marcus said, You know, I used to think your story was about revenge, but it was never that. It was about release. Amara nodded. I stopped fighting the past when I realized it no longer existed. It's just echoes now. They can't hurt me unless I listen. He smiled. And do you still hear them? Sometimes, she admitted, but softer now. They sound less like pain and more like memory. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that felt like presence, not absence. When she returned home that evening, Amara placed Marcus's letter on her nightstand. She didn't frame it, didn't hide it. She let it exist, as it was meant to. A quiet testimony to the kind of connection that doesn't demand, only affirms. She poured herself a glass of water, opened the balcony doors, and stepped into the night. The air was cool, the city alive below. She thought of her past, of Ethan, of Vivian, of the countless women whose stories had woven into hers. And she thought of Marcus, the man who had seen her not as a phoenix, not as an emblem, but as a woman who had learned to live in her own skin. For the first time in years, she felt a deep, unhurried peace, the kind that doesn't come from closure but from continuation. Some stories end with fire, others with forgiveness. Hers, she realized, was ending with grace, and the quiet promise of something beginning again. The morning light in Atlanta had never looked so alive. Golden streaks slid through Amara's window, scattering across her desk, the same one that had once been buried in contracts, crisis plans, and unanswered questions. Now it was clean. One open notebook, one black pen, one letter. Marcus's letter. Amara sat quietly, letting the light soak her face. Outside, the city hummed. Cars, footsteps, fragments of 1,000 lives overlapping. It was ordinary and magnificent all at once. For the first time in years, she felt not the weight of expectation, but the thrill of release. She had done it. Not the rebuilding of her company, though ArcLight thrived beyond imagination. Not the success of the Phoenix Plan, though it had become a global movement, funding hundreds of women. No, what she had done was far greater, far quieter. She had forgiven herself for staying too long, for believing lies dressed as love, for confusing power with protection. Forgiveness wasn't a gift she gave the world. It was a gift she gave herself, the final act of reclamation. That afternoon, she returned to her mother's old house on the outskirts of the city. It was small and sun-warmed, the garden overgrown with wild jasmine. She hadn't been back in years. The door creaked open, releasing the faint smell of earth and memories. The living room was still lined with faded photographs. Her mother in her nursing uniform, Amara as a child holding a coding trophy, both of them laughing as if nothing in the world could touch them. Amara sank onto the couch, dust rising in the sunbeams. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Mama, I made it." It wasn't pride in her voice. It was gratitude, the deep kind that feels like coming home. Her mother had always told her that strength wasn't about holding on. It was about knowing when to let go. And now, sitting in that quiet house, Amara realized she'd finally learned how. Later that week, she flew to New York to speak at a global conference on leadership. But this time, there was no script, no rehearsed cadence. She didn't even stand behind the podium. She stood at the edge of the stage, microphone in hand, barefoot in her heels place, grounding herself in the present. "I used to think freedom was something you earned," she began, her voice steady, rich. "That it came after achievement, after success, after proving yourself worthy. But I was wrong." The audience, thousands of faces, eyes glimmering under the stage lights, leaned forward. "Freedom," she continued, "isn't something you win. It's something you decide. It begins the moment you stop waiting for permission to exist." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, not noise but resonance. She felt it, the collective recognition of people who had spent their lives in cages they'd been taught to decorate. "I've been broken before," she said softly, "by love, by ambition, by my own silence. But I learned something in those fractures. Light gets in through the breaks, and once you've tasted that light, you stop pretending the darkness was ever home." Applause swelled, but she raised a hand. "Not yet. I want you to remember this," she said. "Every empire you build, every dream you chase, every version of yourself you outgrow, it all leads here, to this question. Who are you when there's nothing left to prove?" She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. That's where liberation lives. Not in applause, not in forgiveness from others, but in the quiet yes you give yourself when you finally stop performing. Silence. Then slowly people began to rise, some crying, some clapping, all transformed. That night after the conference, Amara walked alone through Central Park. The city glittered behind her, endless, alive. She thought of Marcus, of Ethan, of Vivian, of her mother, each of them a thread in the fabric of her becoming. None villains, none saints, just mirrors. She sat on a bench beneath the whispering trees and pulled out her phone. She opened her notes app and began to write, not for a book, not for a speech, but for herself. Liberation isn't the absence of pain. It's the refusal to be defined by it. It's the art of walking away without bitterness. It's the peace that comes when you stop asking the world for validation and start giving yourself permission to exist as you are. She looked up at the sky. A plane crossed the stars, a faint streak of light moving towards somewhere new. For years she had chased love, then power, then purpose. Now she wanted only one thing, presence. The next morning she booked a one-way ticket to Ghana, where the Phoenix Plan had just opened its newest branch. Not as a figurehead, not as a savior, but as a mentor, a teacher, a witness. Before she boarded, she sent Marcus a message. "I'm going away for a while. I think I finally understand what it means to start again." He replied simply, "Then fly, Amara." On the flight, as clouds drifted below like rivers of glass, Amara smiled. For the first time, she wasn't running toward anything, or away from anyone. She was just moving, breathing, living. The world stretched open before her like an unwritten page. Liberation, she realized, wasn't the end of her story. It was the first chapter she'd ever written entirely for herself. And as the plane cut through the sky, light spilling across her face, she thought of everyone who'd ever been told they were too much, too loud, too ambitious, too emotional. She wanted to tell them what she now knew in her bones. You are not too much. You are everything the world fears and everything it needs. Stop shrinking. Stop apologizing. Stand in the wreckage and call it a beginning. Let the fire burn. Let the glass break. Let yourself rise. Because liberation isn't waiting for you at the finish line. It's been inside you all along, whispering, "It's time." If her story moved you, let it remind you, someone out there needs your voice, your courage, your light. Share it, speak it, live it, loudly, unapologetically, freely. Because every time one woman rises, the whole world shifts a little closer to its own liberation.